Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar in the series in prelude to the Sustainable Foods London Conference and Exhibition. Thank you all for joining from across the globe. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce Josh Newton, who is the city's program manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We're going to be discussing today all things about food circularity and how we're going to adopt circular models within urban cities. Josh, first of all, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us and to support sustainable foods. Quick intro really about yourself, what you're working on, who you are, etc. It'd be good to welcome and introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jawad. So my name's Josh. I'm City's Program Manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We are a network of over 2,000 organizations, including large corporates, innovators, researchers and academia, and institutions, governments and cities. As City's Program Manager, I cover our relationships with cities around the world, which totals over 50 cities and a combined population of over 100 million people.
Thanks, Josh. I mean, I think we're all quite aware that food is a vital key component of life. I mean, we need it for substance, we need it for pleasure, enjoyment. It brings families together. It's a real vital part of one's life. But even though it is a requirement, I mean, our current food system is clearly, it's come at a cost. We've had rapid globalization, we've had rapid urbanization, we've had significant growth in population as food has become cheaper and more accessible, and the varieties of food have become accessible from all over the world at any point in time. But having read your wonderful work a few years ago, I mean, food is responsible for the majority of waste. For every dollar spent, in society, it's causing double in terms of environmental or health costs. And the environment is, for a better word, the planet's burning, out of which food production and the whole food supply chain is a major component of that, often which is not neglected. I would like to actually first off ask you, for those who are just joining us, really to give a brief overview and flavor on what actually is the current food system and how is it structured, and what is the take and make model, and how is it currently serving us and our people.
Sure. So I'll talk about some features of it, I guess, and then some positives, and then the as you've already hit on some of the externalities and challenges
from your great work.
I know you did. You answered the question for me. No, I suppose our current food system is characterized by a couple of factors. So it's increasingly industrial, it's global, and it's underpinned by fossil fuels. So it's we're increasingly relying on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides to make sure that we can drive production, improve productivity, and meet the needs of a growing population. That over the last 50, 60, 70 years has helped us respond to the challenge of increased population and driven productivity, but it has come at a significant cost. Our current food system is I characterize it in 4 ways. So I would say our food system currently, as a linear system, is wasteful and inefficient. It's sensitive to price shocks. It's bad for our health, and then also bad for the environment. So in terms of wasteful, around 30 to 40% of all food is wasted across the supply chain. That's because it's inefficient.
Astronomical.
And food that's edible is lost or spoiled. Sorry, what were you going to say, Jawad?
No, I'm saying that's an astronomical amount. 40% of food is wasted.
Wow. And food waste accounts for about 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. But that's wasteful and inefficient. But I think, given that I mentioned emissions, food as a whole is responsible for about 30 to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We know that food and our food system is also responsible for over half of human-induced biodiversity loss. And that's just not nice to have. Biodiversity is crucial for our food system. We need pollinators to pollinate our plants for us to ultimately be able to grow them and eat them. I would say I mentioned it was global as well, just to mention that because our food system is reliant on lots of inputs, particularly synthetic inputs. When there is a war in a faraway country, that affects global supply chains, it affects oil prices, and that ultimately increases the costs of inputs for farmers. If we can create a system that is lower input, less reliant on additional fossil fuels, and we can grow food using nature, we're going to reduce the cost of food, or at least ensure that it's more stable and more resilient.
Can I ask, how did our food system end up this way? Because severe industrialization obviously has strong positives, but in terms of the culture of bringing in food from across the world, and that's off season. I mean, when did our food system start progressing into this manner? Back, as you said, 50, 60 years ago, whenever all food was regenerative, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the state of play of where we are now is that you could put forward an argument that there was a prevailing thought that there were initial big wins from using fertilizers and pesticides. It did mean that we could create a system that was far more convenient for people, that was more diverse. But unfortunately, it's kind of been an enemy of its own success, in that we now expect oranges throughout the year. We expect aubergines throughout the year. We're not eating seasonally, which is, there's a lot of other associated emissions with it.
No, I couldn't agree more. And when you have breaks in the supply chain, whether that's COVID or the recent war in Ukraine, you just really highlight the broken nature actually of the food supply chain, and how things can rapidly deteriorate and change and fluctuate, cause extreme change to all of us.
Absolutely. And so, there's price shocks. So the economics, I mentioned the environmental costs. We could also think about the health costs. We know that the work that we did back in 2019 found that every pound that we spend on food, society pays around £2 in terms of health and environmental costs. And we know now, and we can see there's an increasing body of evidence, scientific evidence, that shows that food that's grown organically or regeneratively is better for nutrition. And we know that food that is ultra processed has very significant negative effects on human health. Higher causes of cancer, it's one of the leading causes of non-communicable diseases and early deaths in the world.
I guess you've been reading Chris Van Tukelen's book as well on ultra-processed food. I'd like to ask, I mean, how did the foundation and yourself, really decide to write such an innovative piece? Because for all those that aren't aware, Josh and his team contributed to the Cities and Circular Economy for Food program, I guess, for another word, or research in, was it 2019, 2020?
Yeah. So we published that in 2019. And then I've been working on the mobilization phase of that report for the last 3-4 years. So kind of trying to turn its findings into practice with a number of cities around the world. I suppose kind of the starting point was really just trying to flip the question upside down, really. So we know that the current food system is bad for health, bad for the environment, costs a lot. So what if we tried to create a food system that internalized those externalities? What if we created a food system that rather was a leading contributor to climate change? It was a leading solution to climate change. What if, rather than trying to bend nature to grow food using these synthetic and highly industrial processes, we actually learned from nature and grew with it? In nature, nothing becomes waste, everything becomes food for nature. And so learning from nature-based solutions and biomimicry, we can apply that to our food system. I think the other thing that I heard a really great podcast the other day on materials in the world on the BBC, and it was saying how we need to grow more food over the next 40 years than we have done ever in the last 8,000 years of farming. And so we have to not only grow more food, but also where we have worsening soil health and an increasing population and increasingly unpredictable weather patterns and climate. So ultimately, I guess the current system is not fit for purpose, and we need to change it.
It's a nice lead into
Yeah.
what is the circular food system
Sure.
that you guys have proposed, and how can it really change the way we view food, the way we grow food, and the real future of food.
Yeah. So nothing we're saying is
Wild.
revelatory.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to learn. We're learning from our past, we're learning from indigenous cultures, we're learning from well-established research bodies and organizations like Soil Association, Sustainable Food Places, Sustain in the UK, Sustainable Food Trust. But yeah, so we developed a framework to help cities think about how they could support a transition to a regenerative food system. And that's ultimately based on 3 pillars. So the first one is growing and producing food using practices that lead to regenerative outcomes. That is different in different places, but typically involves techniques like cover cropping, intercropping, crop rotation, no dig. And we can come on to these if that's helpful. But crucially, alongside the production, there's the supply chain part. So wherever possible, we should be trying to promote shorter supply chains that help connect farmers better with the plate that the food will be served on. And ultimately, that involves arguably growing more food in cities. The second pillar, which we'll hopefully hear more about at your conference, as I know my colleague Rhaenyra is talking about our food design work, is all about that food design. So that's rethinking not only what we grow, but what we eat and how we eat, and evolving our diets and menu options so that they are more diverse, they are lower impact, and they minimize waste as best as possible. And then our third pillar in cities is then trying to create a robust system to ensure that food is never wasted, and that we have a redistribution system and a supply chain system that can make sure that food is reused or upcycled wherever possible, or if necessary, can be recovered and turned back into nutrients that can then go back as organic inputs to farming.
I would like to go back actually to ask you about growing regeneratively and locally at scale. I mean, how do you do that in a city? Obviously, they're extremely densely populated. I'm in London, and that's a population of roughly 8 million. You go to countries and cities further abroad, you have tens of millions. So how do you grow regeneratively? Obviously, in places like London, but even more so in countries and cities where the populations are, as I said, 80, 90 million people.
Yeah.
Is that even feasible?
Yeah, well, our argument is that we'll never get to full self-sufficiency, but I suppose it's about rethinking what the current balance is. So in London, for example, where I live as well, and we work with the city, we know that less than 1% of the food eaten here comes from the peri-urban area of London. If we can turn that 1% to 5% or 10%, then we're going to build greater resilience and unlock a whole load of other benefits to the city. But we can point to lots of really good examples elsewhere, places like Milan, Paris, Singapore, all of which are trying to set bold targets to support an increased amount of urban agriculture. And that requires a lot of choices around planning and making sure there's enough green space. It's ensuring skills, the skills are there, and that there's the capital and funding support to help farmers start up. But there's no reason why it can't exist. In London, there are a number of farms and they are buoyant and could grow, but they just need the right conditions. And I can talk about a few examples if that's helpful.
Please. I mean, I would also, is that where indoor vertical farming can also play an important part? I mean, I'd love to hear more on that, and also examples you have.
Absolutely. I mean, I think indoor vertical farming is absolutely not a silver bullet. Like, it's limited in the kind of foods it can grow. I think leafy greens typically, but ultimately, they are definitely part of a package. They can utilize kind of underused buildings or spaces. I know there's a number of projects in London, for example, But at the same time, I know there's high energy costs for that. I guess I'm talking as well about conventional farming, and balancing it and making sure that we support those conventional farmers to transition to more regenerative practices, and helping them create supply chains into the city. So a good example, for example, is Milan. So Milan are a winner of they created the Milan Urban Food Pact, and won the first ever Earthshot Prize for a waste-free world. Part of that work was involving they're working with local farmers. So I think a consortium of 31 farmers in the region, and to procure the fruit and vegetables that they grew and make sure that goes directly to schools. That has a really important imperative, because it helps the schools and children eat seasonally. It helps the farmers and helps share wealth around the city. It also helps reduce emissions and support those farmers to transition. And ultimately create shorter supply chains. And through activities like that, they helped, I think, the carbon footprint of school meals in the city reduced by, I think, 20% over 5 years.
Well, I mean, these are great, initiatives that we could probably implement here in the UK. I mean, are you getting pushback, Josh, from some of the work you've done, in terms of, the steps that you recommend? You also mentioned, in terms of getting produce from farmers straight to consumers. So that's, a direct to local consumer model. I mean, you're getting pushback from retailers, from the, from the food and drink industry in general.
No, I'd say we have a warm reception from them, and I think we can look at a lot of really good examples by the private sector, as well as the public sector, that are helping us move to this model. We do have to balance that with convenience, and that's around engaging consumers in that and making them appreciate that not everything they want is available all the time. So there is a big consumer engagement point. But at least for cities, I would say that, I mean, the Milan Urban Food Pact that I mentioned now has over 200 cities committed to the principles of a circular economy for food. So more and more cities are buying into the idea of building food resilience and food security through urban agriculture, taking action on diets, and taking action on food waste. And what's important is that the public sector, cities cannot do that alone. They do require, I guess, new creative relationships, to be honest, radical thinking from businesses to work with the city to align on those targets. I think it's hard for a city itself to a city cannot do everything. They are also heavily resource constrained, and can only often lead by example with the money that they spend. And to be honest, retailers, food brands, they're closer connected to consumers in some ways than cities. We know that, for example, Unilever or Premier Foods, everyone, like 9 in 10 people around the world have a Unilever product in their in their cupboards. So there's a huge opportunity there for brands like that, and the brands owned by Unilever to actually build that connection with consumers and help empower them to think smarter and do that.
And we've got a couple of questions. I'll kick off with some. Should we repurpose land within cities for food production? You've partly answered that. But in terms of allotments, used to represent a large portion of land within cities before they were repurposed by councils and sold off on the cheap to developers.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing an increasing number of cities. I think Paris is a really good example of that. They already have something like 25% of food that's eaten in the city comes from the Greater Paris Basin, but they have a goal for 50% of food by 2030 that is eaten in the city to come from their region, which is huge. When you think about London is only 1% or less than 1%.
Yeah.
To do that, they have allocated more. They've committed, I think, something like 15 hectares of new land to be given to growers. I also think that the challenge as well with allotments and things like that is that they are private. Well, they are used for private. They're obviously public goods, but used for private individuals. And I know that there's a number of models that are evolving and emerging now that are trying to help coordinate and create a community of growers in allotments so that they can all grow together and learn together, and grow ultimately with nature rather than using negative farming practices.
Allotments seem to be, they used to be far more common than they are now. I mean, I don't want to say it's a dying art, because there are quite a few people very passionate and tend to the allotments, but it's very rare to find people who, especially in my part of the country, where it's,
Well, I know,
especially in urban cities, where it's even on
yeah.
the radar.
Well, I know I know that in the UK, I think most councils have a huge waiting list for allotments. There is the
So
demand,
it's space as well.
but yeah, it's a capacity constraint as well on the council, to make sure that they're being used, and how do you transfer like temporary ownership of them. But yeah, I'd say private growing is a really important part of it, but also it's about supporting market gardens and an actual enterprise to get on land in cities and in the peri-urban area to grow food and make it part of their job.
Got another question from Sebastian about successful composting in big emerging cities. Do you have any good practice, tips, or experience?
Well, so one of our member cities at the foundation is Porto. They've just completed a multi-year project called City Loops, which involved in creating a new system for food waste in the city. In London, for example, most boroughs have a food waste collection service. In lots of local authorities, there's a food waste collection, but that's very industrial, and that food goes to anaerobic digestion. In Porto, what they're doing in dense areas where it's actually quite hard to do kind of industrial food collection is composting, and they've hired a number of their official roles are community composters or chief composters, and they go around the city making sure that there are food waste compost heaps which are secured.
Amazing.
So resistant to kind of infiltration from vermin and other such things. They go around and make sure that those composting piles are healthy, and that when they're ready to go, they can then be returned to a peri-urban farmer in the Porto region.
I've got a really good question, which I'll post to you at the end, Josh. But I'd like to touch now on nutrition. So obviously one of the second pillar, I believe, is in terms of how circular economy is impacting nutrition. How are we going to encourage, consumers to look at what they eat and how they eat? And in terms of changing dietary habits, that's, is that really, are we looking at governmental led support, or, how can we support the circular economy from nutrition at a consumer level?
That is a
hard
deep
one.
question. I know there's Eat Lancet, for example, on a global level that's trying to create a planetary diet. I know there's apps and products like Zoe now that's led by Tim Spector that's also trying to build a literacy in food and nutrition. I think there's a number of ways around it, and I don't think it should just be on the state. I mean, ultimately, we do need to create a market where consumers do not have to feel like they have to choose between the bad and the less bad. In a circular economy and a circular economy for food, we need a food system which consumers can only make good choices. And that requires a level of literacy and a confidence to cook, access to good, healthy, nutritious food. I think one of the perverse issues at the moment with our food system as well is that actually the cheapest foods are the ones that are worse for our health. So that requires like a number of steps, and there's a whole set of policy levers that cities and national governments can take. One, I would say, is procurement, and there are not many silver bullets in the fight for climate and tackling biodiversity loss. But I would say one kind of big measure that could make a huge difference is a high standard of universal free school meals, where all children get access to healthy, nutritious food, regardless of income. And states can ensure public goods for public money. So they can purchase organic or regenerative food. They can make sure that they buy high standard, high welfare types of meat, and promote a flexitarian diet. In places like Scandinavia and Paris, we are already seeing cities set goals to equip citizens with
Really?
changing their diets and understanding that diets, it's not just for the environment, it is for their health. As I said, every pound we spend on food, it costs society £2. So we all have an interest in making sure that we have a diverse source of proteins. And I think if we get into this meat debate, it is divisive and political, and it doesn't need to.
It's already been politicized this week, you know. So we're not introducing a meat tax, when actually that conversation was never even really brought up. So,
and closer to home in London, for example, they have launched a campaign called Eat Like a Londoner, which is recognizing that actually lots of Londoners from lots of different cultures and diasporas are already eating a diverse source of proteins and eating plant-rich diets. Many live flexitarian lifestyles. And so this campaign that's involving the mayors, the GLA, as well as like over 20 different boroughs, the foundation are a partner, as well as a number of corporate partners that are to be announced in the next few weeks. They're trying to promote the idea of plant-rich menu options and recipes that we can all adopt.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm a flexitarian, and it's predominantly for obviously environmental, but also the health concerns. It's not price for a lot of people is a key factor, but also, the education around it and cooking nutritionally. I think it's just so vitally important starting at a young age and learning to cook, which is a dying art. People just don't have the time, or prefer to do things far more quickly. I would like to end on the question by Carol, which I think is fascinating, in terms of, she mentions that when people talk about food, it's generally land-based food systems. So the two-parter. The first is, why aren't we including seafood and fish in the conversation about better food systems? And secondly, when it's mentioned, animal welfare seems to be low on the priority. So if seafood, fish is seen as a good source of protein with low carbon footprint, shouldn't we learn from previous errors made by previous food systems and not replicate it in our seas? So this is a question about really what's the circular economy like for fish and seafood?
I'd say from a city's
to come.
Well, from a city's perspective, I think 2/3 of cities are on the sea or on the coast, and I think kind of 1-2 billion people, a significant portion of the world, rely on fish as their main source of protein. I think it's, again, a balance. I know in London, for example, we do focus on land because actually we know that that's an important needs to change. There are whole other conversations in the ocean that we don't talk about, unfortunately. But I know in London, for example, there is a requirement, or there has already been movement through the food strategy that came in 2018, that all fish that was eaten in public canteens strive to be MSC certified, so a trusted standard of fishing.
Cool. Thank you for that, Joe. I put you under the spot there to discuss fish. We're actually out of time. That was went by rather too quickly for my liking. It was a great chat with you, Josh. So thank you for joining. I'd like to remind everyone that is watching that this is part of the Sustainable Foods London conference. Josh's colleagues will be there to discuss the Big Food redesign project on the morning of the 7th. So please do join us. Go to our website, sustainablefoodevent.com, to get your tickets. The show is in 5.5-6 weeks. Josh has put in some links for you in the chat about his cities and circular economy work they've done. So thank you again, Josh. That was really, really great. And we hope to see you soon, and take care, and looking forward to hearing more from the foundation in the coming weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jawad.
Thank you.